Thank you to everyone joining us today for this informative speaker series event on crisis, support, and suicide prevention for autistic people. Lisa Morgan is a consultant specializing in crisis support and suicide prevention for autistic people. She founded the Autism and Suicide Committee at the American Association of Suicidology and has developed several autism-specific resources for communicating and supporting autistic people in crisis. She is currently the co-chair of the Autism and Suicide Prevention Work Group. A self-advocate with a passion for strengths-based solutions, Lisa has authored several books, articles, and resources, all available on her website, autismcrisissupport.com. She is a community council member of AASET, Autistic Adults and Other Stakeholders Engaged Together, a group of autistic adults informing autism research priorities. And without further ado, I'd like to give the floor to today's speaker, Lisa Morgan. Thank you, Lisa.
There, thank you very much. It's good to be here tonight, and welcome to everybody. Let's see. So I'm going to be talking tonight about crisis supports and suicide prevention for the autism community. And I always want to start off saying that in my presentations and in my personal life, I use identity first language, which means autistic person instead of person first language, which would be person with autism. There's a really great paper out there if you want to learn more about that. I do know that the latest research on it showed an overwhelmingly amount of autistic adults prefer identity first language. Also, I'm going to be talking about suicide and crisis supports for autistic people. So if anyone gets triggered, I always like to put out these numbers. The National Suicide Prevention Lifeline now is 988. And then you can also text 988 as well, but you can also text 741-741, text the word home, and you can get some support if needed. And I'm going to first start out with just understanding autism a little bit. There's two ways to see it. There's the medical model, which a lot of professionals see autistic people through a medical model lens. And then there's the social model, which a lot of autistic people view themselves and other autistic people. So one of them is strength-based and one of them is deficit-based. So the medical model tends to be deficit-based and looks at what autistic people really can't do. Looks at it as a disability, where autistic people tend to look at abilities and even supporting autistic people in any way, shape, or form, but in crisis as well, their abilities are going to help support them. And that they're functional, not dysfunctional, and that it is a condition, not a disorder. Those are just two different ways of looking at autism. And looking at it through the medical model, many professionals don't see the need to even assess an autistic person for suicide. I'm part of some research projects where we're working with clinicians, and they have, shared that when they see an autistic person in for crisis, they don't even think to assess them for suicide. First responders don't understand ways to work with an autistic person in crisis. A lot of times, an autistic person in crisis may not disclose they're autistic. There was a resource that's out there right now, Crisis Supports for the Autism Community, that does show ways to both identify and support autistic people in crisis. Also, the behavior of autistic people can be misunderstood and reacted to in a negative way. But most importantly of all is when looking at autistic people from that medical model, autistic people do not get their needs met. And the result is unintentional harm. So what is unintentional harm? It is, what happens when an autistic person reaches out for support and instead is met with rejection, invalidation, misunderstandings or even frustration from support people and professionals. Unintentional harm is rooted in misconceptions, in stigma, and preconceived notions about autistic people. And then those thoughts and beliefs are reflected back to autistic people through the professionals that interact with them. So I just had, my story is that I started advocating for autistic people as an autistic person after my husband died by suicide in 2015. The night that I found his body was full of there was so many people around there to support me, helping people in helping professions. And yet at the end of the night, I felt completely and utterly profoundly alone, misunderstood. And that's when I understood unintentional harm. I had this hand was put on my shoulder for encouragement, but at the time I did not know that. I didn't know it was coming. It was a heavy hand of one of the police officers. He was guiding me across the street where I was going to be asked questions from the sergeant. It was so heavy. I didn't know if I did something wrong. I didn't know why it was so heavy. I didn't know anything, but everything went towards just alarms going off that what is happening kind of thing. And my anxiety was already really high, and it just pushed it higher. And every time I thought about that night for months afterwards, that I could feel that hand on my shoulder because I didn't understand it. That was a simple encouragement from somebody but it ended up being traumatic for me. As well, I live with suicidal ideation, and this past August, I texted into 988, the crisis line, and I disclosed my diagnosis of autism. I said I was autistic, and that I was having, overwhelming suicidal thoughts. And at one point, what the person on the other end was saying was just a little bit too much for me. And I asked if we could sit in silence. And the thing that came back to me, his words that came back to me through the text were, well, I can't sit with you all night long. And that confused me. And I said, well, can you talk to me? And he said, I can't talk to you all night long. And that confused me more. And then I asked for clarification, and he said, you're being combative. And he hung up on me. And that's what I mean by unintentional harms. There's some disconnect between the way autistic people communicate and non-autistic people communicate that results in autistic people being unintentionally harmed. It could also be working with professionals who kind of invalidate the autistic diagnosis. So saying, aren't we all a little autistic? No, I have, a master's degree. I'm working on my second master's degree. And there are some days where just doing life is very, very hard for me. And it's very invalidating for somebody to say, well, aren't we all a little autistic? It takes away all the strife that, someone who has autism goes through. And you need an autistic brain to be autistic. And then you're somewhere on the spectrum. Or you don't look autistic. And that's because the autistic person is probably masking, using up all kinds of energy. It's exhausting to mask, and you can't do it for a really long time. And it's a unique risk of suicide. It's a unique risk factor of suicide for autistic people. And so we don't, the person is right, but that is a bit invalidating as well. And I've also heard, but you have a job or a marriage or children. I thought you wrote a book. I mean, those are all, they're coming from a place of, that's where the unintention is. It's not coming from a place of intentionally harming at all, but it just ends up because people don't understand, it ends up being harm. So some examples would be possibly communicating with them in a way they might not understand, figurative speech, especially if they're in a crisis. and then being frustrated with them for not understanding. Putting a supportive hand on their shoulder, which I just explained to you without asking first, which can be very dysregulating, sensory wise, and not at all comforting for an autistic person. And this is not speaking for every autistic person, but in a crisis, you know, when you are having a regression of skills, your anxiety is sky high, you know, and all sensory things are going on for you. It really goes for a lot of autistic people. Insisting on eye contact or deciding why the autistic person is avoiding eye contact. I've heard, you know, well, they're not looking at me because they're lying, or they're refusing to participate, or they're refusing to cooperate, when an autistic person has lots of reasons why they might not be making eye contact. They might be trying to regulate so hard that making eye contact is just one of those things they have to let go, or making eye contact may hurt their eyes. There's many reasons. It could be that someone's talking too fast and then getting frustrated because they have to repeat what they said. Because with an autistic person in crisis, their processing speed slows down. It can be frustration over having to write things down, because I am not going to remember anything that was said to me if I'm in a crisis situation the next hour sometimes. Or explain things in a different way because of that figurative speech and not understanding. And so, you know, explaining it in a different way. I've experienced all of these things. So unintentional harm by well-meaning, supportive people is still harm. And now I'm going to talk a little bit about using strengths of autistic people to support them. So there are strengths. You know, there's a lot of people that, you know, in other trainings where I say, okay, give me some strengths of autistic people, and there's crickets. But there are strengths, and there are strengths that can be used for crisis support. They're creative, they're problem solvers. They're going to be honest. So they're going to tell exactly what's happening if they can. They adhere to routine. So using a safety plan, or staying safe, or, you know, reducing access to means. Adhering to a routine can come in very handy for that. Detail oriented, again, writing safety plans, keeping themselves safe. Rule based, that's kept me safe many times. In reducing access to means, and knowing that I am, you know, experiencing suicidal ideation, so I might not even go in the house where there's access to means. I might stay outside and go for a walk. I have rules. They're fair, you know, so maybe saying, you know, is that fair to you if you harm yourself, or if you have plans to kill yourself, is it fair to your family, or, you know, your friend, your pet? They tend to be autistic people tend to, you know, be very fair, and again, problem solvers. The challenges of autistic people also need to be taken into consideration when supporting them. So there's all kinds of things. There's sensory issues, executive functioning issues can get in the way of keeping yourself safe. Social situations and communication can put somebody into a crisis. The rigidity and perseveration can keep somebody in a crisis. Change is very difficult. Co-occurring disorders. There was a study done in Denmark that showed, this was a study that was done over a 20-year period, had over 6.5 million study participants. And out of the autistic people, 90% had co-occurring disorders, with the highest being anxiety. There's a slower processing speed to work with. Alexithymia, which is the inability to explain or even understand your own emotions. A lot of, at least 50% of autistic people have alexithymia. And then there's sleep disorders, which, you know, if you're not getting enough sleep, that can make everything worse. And then rumination on negative thoughts or whatever put them in a crisis can be very difficult to get them out. Excuse me. So what do we know about autism and suicide? Excuse me, I just got to mute for a second. Well, autistic individuals are significantly more likely to think about, attempt, or die by suicide than the general population. It's up to, research has shown up to 7 times higher. The suicide rate is up to 7 times higher than the general population. It's a leading cause of premature death for autistic people without an intellectual disability. Autistic people have unique risk factors and all the rest of the risk factors for the general population. Getting support is a social skill, and many are unintentionally harmed when they reach out for support. And a lot of autistic people won't even call or text a crisis line. We need to understand what the protective factors are, if there are any. What we know about protective factors is that if autistic people can be themselves, and don't have to mask, you know, and the culture of autistic people can be accepted, that could be suicide prevention right there. That study in Denmark also found that the protective factors of the general population were not protective for autistic people. So marriage or habituating, employment, higher education, those ended up not being protective factors. In fact, those are things that can put autistic people in crisis. All right, so I'm going to talk about a couple of the resources that we have. The first one is Considerations of Warning Signs resource. The purpose of this was to develop an awareness of autism when assessing autistic people for suicide, because the warning signs of suicide for the general population do not meet the needs of autistic people. So to understand there is a need for considerations, to recognize the differences, and then to support autistic people as autistic people. And what I mean by that is a lot of autistic people have said that it's almost like they're treated like neurotypical people with a little bit of autism on top, but it's really a different type of support is needed for autistic people. And there's a metaphor I like to use, and it uses some beloved animals that usually everybody either knows or has, and they're dogs and cats. And you would never support a dog in the same way you would support a cat, because the cat would be unintentionally harmed. I have cats, and I can leave my cats for a weekend. You know, I probably wouldn't leave them any longer than that. Give them some extra food, water, they're fine. They don't even care. They don't even know I'm gone. I could never do that with, you know, we had a dog who passed away last year. I could never do that with her. You know, if I'm gone for an hour, she greeted me like I was gone for months. So there's different support needs. And really, you have to look at autistic people and non-autistic people in the same way. You can't even modify, you know, how I might support our dog Zoe, and as to how we support our cats. You can't even, they need completely different ways of support. If I pat my cats too much, you know, they let me know, the claws come out, I'm done. But I can't play or pat with the dog enough. So, you know, it's completely different. And that's the way we have to think about with autistic people. So the structure of this resource states warning signs for the general public, shows needs for considerations, and supports for autistic people in crisis. So first I'm going to show the warning signs of suicide for the general public. And they're right here. And I'm going to go through each one of them and show the considerations that may need to be taken when you're assessing an autistic person using these warning signs of suicide. But I do always like to say that these, although these are considerations to pay attention to when assessing, do not make any important life-altering decisions based on the information in the following slides. All the warning signs of the general public pertain to autistic people too, just with considerations about autism. This information here is to broaden existing knowledge about autistic people, and just something to remember when you're working with autistic people. They know the most about themselves, and really the job of professionals helping would be to make space for them, for autistic people, to communicate how to best help them. And then some things to remember from the first training, the thinking process of autistic people is typically very literal. So consider the exact meaning of what you say when supporting an autistic person. Remember, autistic people will answer what they're asked in a literal way and may give a response, but not the information you're looking for. So for example, do you want to hurt yourself? They may say no, because they don't want to hurt yourself, and that's what you asked. So they may be planning on hurting themselves, though. They may be planning on hurting themselves, but so you'd have to ask a very literal question. Are you planning on hurting yourself? Do you have plans to hurt yourself? I wouldn't even put, what is it, the adverb today on it, because they may be planning on it tomorrow or the next day, and they may say, no, I don't have any plans to kill myself today, and not elaborate that they do have plans for tomorrow. That elaboration may not happen due to so many things: high anxiety, slow processing speed, just weren't asked. So being very literal is supportive. Asking for exactly what you need. Oops. And then all the information about communicating from the Autism Crisis Toolkit is relevant in assessing an autistic person for suicide. So more on communicating is asking that question that's too general or vague may be difficult. And there's just so many ways to answer a question that's very broad, like even how are you or how can I help? There's so many ways, and an autistic person its mind will go in all those different ways. Better would be, right to the point, few words as possible. Why did you call or text? What do you want to talk about? If you feel like you're being a little bit too blunt, you're probably right on for an autistic person in crisis. Honesty, straight to the point, few words as possible. So considerations, increased substance abuse. While new research is coming out that shows that autistic people do use alcohol or drugs to regulate and stay regulated, in general, they're less likely to abuse substances. They may be stimming, they may be regulating themselves, and it looks like they have used some substances or have used some alcohol. But they may be, you may not, they may come across somebody who's not seen stimming before, or, the different kinds of stimming, or how autistic people may regulate themselves. So finding out what exactly is going on is supportive. And that's the way you'll find it throughout this whole toolkit, is investigating exactly what's going on for the autistic person. No reason for living, no sense of purpose in life. An autistic person may feel this way due to social isolation, and a professional can take into consideration an autistic person saying, I don't belong to this world, I've never fit into this world, as just their reality of not belonging culturally, socially, environmentally. So investigating more and finding out what is it exactly behind it. Are you saying that you don't belong because you are leaving, or you just literally, that's your truth, you don't belong, you feel like you don't belong? Anxiety, agitation, sleep issues. Well, these are things that autistic people struggle with pretty regularly. And so how might one know if there's signs of suicide? And that would be, again, investigating, finding out exactly what's going on for this person using concise, specific language, investigating any changes in level of anxiety, agitation, or sleep issues, either by asking directly, or if you know the person and you've been working with them, kind of long term, you may know that there's a change from baseline. But during the investigation process, it's really important to communicate in a way that they are going to understand, so you can get the information you need to assess. Feeling trapped. Autistic people can't escape their autism or how society in our culture treats them. So they may say, They feel trapped. There's no way out. And they will, again, be very honest about that. And so consider, again, saying if the blatant truth about someone's life as an autistic person is a warning sign of suicide. Because we want to make sure that if we have an autistic person who is suicidal, we want to catch that, but we don't want to, go through the process of what happens when an autistic person is suicidal when they're just being autistic, because that can cause unintentional harm as well. Hopelessness. It's a myth that autistic people don't have or feel emotions. It's true that a lot of them can't identify or express their emotions. And with being completely honest, they say they feel hopeless because they really do feel hopeless. And it's, again, their truth. It could be a word choice, not an emotion. But again, finding out what's going on for them, why did they say it, where is that coming from, would be most supportive. Withdrawal, this warning sign of suicide is actually a coping mechanism for a lot of autistic people. It's self-care and can also be a warning sign of suicide. So determining changes in level, type of withdrawal, changes from baseline, do they come out regulated? Do they come out and they're still dysregulated? There's a lot of different things to look for there. But again, investigating with the autistic person in a way that, the communication makes sense to them and they can answer and give the information that you need to support them. This warning sign of suicide could be the result of an overactive sympathetic nervous system. Alexithymia and autism can hide strong emotions that an autistic person may be experiencing and not knowing that they're experiencing it. And all of a sudden, it all comes to the surface. And it can look like rage, uncontrolled anger. An autistic meltdown can look like rage or uncontrolled anger. Can't be stopped by will or want. It has to run its course. And of course, keeping the person safe is the priority there. But there are other things that can be going on for an autistic person instead of this being a warning sign of suicide. Acting reckless or engaging in risky activities. Being misunderstood is pretty common for autistic people. And this might look like this warning sign for the general population. It actually could be an autistic person overthinking and even walking into traffic, and it looks like they're trying to harm themselves or die by suicide, but they're just so deep in thought. They could be perseverating again, in a combination of overthinking and perseverating. Deeply thinking, confusion, just so much happening at one time. They can't keep everything kind of in balance to keep themselves safe, especially, in an environment that has a lot of things going on. And they may do something that is reckless or, looks like they're trying to harm themselves when they're just confused because of all the sensory stimulation. And stimming can look reckless if someone's not used to it. So any number of these things, and there's probably even more that can look this way. So determining what is actually going on for the autistic person is just so important. Dramatic mood changes. These can be caused by overwhelming emotions. Again, with alexithymia, you can feel no emotion at all. You can be feeling something, but it might come out as a headache or a backache or stomach ache. But it's actually emotions. Or you can just have them all at once just come out, and all of a sudden there's a mood change. It could be a sensory overload that, has been building up over a while, and then all of a sudden, the autistic person is in crisis. Change can put an autistic person in crisis. And, one of the examples that I tell is when my boys were in a grief group for children after their dad died by suicide. The moms had to stay, the parents had to stay. And I was in a group, and there were two adult groups. And I was in one group pretty comfortable in the group after a while. And one night after we had all sat down and took our coats off and just everything was normal, we started the meeting, and a facilitator came in and said, you guys have to, grab your coats, grab your drinks, get up. We have to move, and we have to join this other adult group because we're missing a facilitator. We're down one facilitator tonight. And everybody just jumped up and grabbed their purses and their coats and their coffees and everything, and they headed out the door. And I burst into tears because it was just too much change for me, and it was too quick, and I couldn't catch up. And that, a support group is a vulnerable place anyway, and I just burst into tears. So somebody said that they would stay with me, and they did. They didn't say a word. They just said, we'll be in when Lisa's ready. So there was that presumed competence, which was wonderful. And then, it took about 10 minutes or so, and we both went into the other adult group together, where I couldn't participate, but it was a win that I could stay. And so that change can do that for autistic people. So, possibly reframing the situation to help them perceive what happened in a different way. If something did happen to them and they did react that way, or like I just explained, kind of stay with them and being quiet and just wait till they can regulate. Giving away prized possessions or seeking long-term care for pets. There are autistic people who have strong emotional connections to with possessions, and many who are connected to pets, some who serve as therapy pets. So this behavior does warrant further investigation, especially if it's very meaningful to them, and all of a sudden they're going to give it away. But you have to remember the person you're helping. There could be other reasons why autistic people are giving away their prized possessions. And I do have an example to share. Is this 12, but I think he was 10 years old, autistic boy who had this little blue car. He named it. He had it everywhere he went. It was him in this car for a very, very long time. Sleeping, eating, playing, him and the car were inseparable. And then one day he came to me and very gently cradling it in both of his hands with his eyes moist and emotional. He asked me if I would keep it for him because he cared for it too much. So something inside of him realized he was too emotionally connected to it. I told him that I would keep it safe for him. I checked in with him over, a few months, and I believe as an adult, he still has it. So if I saw him and we didn't have that conversation, and I saw him without that car and he was not upset, I would be very concerned, because he was so attached to it. So that was considerations, the considerations, warning signs of suicide, we call it. This is another resource, and it is a proposed set of warning signs of suicide specifically for autistic people. It was an international team of subject matter experts who developed this resource over the course of a little over a year. We have clinicians, we have researchers, we have autistic people, we have some with dual roles. And what we have is a proposed set of warning signs of suicide. And here they are. As you see, they're going to be pretty much different than the warning signs of suicide for the general population. They're really based on an increase or decrease from baseline. The first one, sudden or increased withdrawal, no words to communicate acute distress, a current traumatic event, marked increase in rate or severity of self-harm. And notice we didn't put self-harm, it's an increase of rate or severity of self-harm. Worsening of anxiety or depression, a new focus on death-related topics that are not a special interest, perseverative suicidal thoughts or ruminations, seeking means or making plans for suicide or suicidal rehearsal, statements about no reason for living or no sense of purpose in life. And then hopelessness was the only one that is in the warning signs of suicide for the general population. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a couple of scenarios, because we have scenarios for each warning sign. Sometimes there's more than one scenario for a warning sign. And then we have the research that backs up the scenarios. So that's what this resource is really good for, is showing what it might look like for an autistic person to have this warning sign. So the scenario that goes with sudden or increased withdrawal is that Lucia routinely withdraws for self-care. Her family and friends understand the need she has for alone time. They know Lucia will be spending time in her room for a while after school, work, and social events, and then will immerse herself in making clay animals. Suddenly, Lucia's family and friends noticed she was spending more and more time in her room. Lucia goes straight to her room when she gets home, only coming out for meals. She continues to participate in her usual activities, although she doesn't want to, and takes longer to regulate afterwards. Lucia no longer is interested in making her clay animals and has not replaced that passion with another. So someone who's using this toolkit will read this scenario for the warning sign, sudden or increased withdrawal. And what the scenario shows, it shows a few things. And I'm kind of going a little slow here, so I'm hoping that you can decide for yourself on some of these things before I give it away. But first of all, her family knows that she withdraws, but she has been withdrawing more and more in her room, and she goes straight to her room when she gets home, coming out for meals. She takes longer to regulate. That's also, a red flag. She takes longer to regulate. It's also a red flag that she has lost her interest in making her clay animals, which is her special passion. So autistic people can, some have a special passion from childhood through the lifespan, and they never, waver from it. And it's something that they're always intensely interested in. And some have different ones along the way. And so it could be that Lucia is just, her interest in clay animals is waning, and there's a period of time where there's not a new special interest, or there could be another special interest right away. But that's something that is definitely something that should perk up, her family's interest in what's going on here, between the withdrawing more and less regulation, and the disinterest in her clay animals. But there's one more thing in this scenario that's really, really important to know when you're supporting an autistic person. And that is, it's not a good indication. It's not a good indicator that she continues to participate in her usual activities, because an autistic person may just not have the energy to not participate in their usual activities. So that's something that I know a lot of, supportive people in support positions ask, well, is she still going to school? Are they still going to work? Are they still going to their social events? Do they still bowl every Thursday night? Well, if the answer is yes, then that's good then. At least she's still doing the usual activities. Not so for autistic people. Change is so difficult that a change from the usual activities and not going would be more indicative that something's wrong than if they do continue to participate, because going along with that schedule takes less energy. Even though they have to may get out and go in a car and they may have to, interact with people, it still can be and is worth investigating, that it just is too much energy to not do those usual activities. So what research showed us was that increased withdrawal without regulating is a cause for concern, coupled with reduced interest or pleasure in a previously intense interest is very concerning. And that research suggested together these are unique warning signs for depression in autistic people, which could include suicidal thoughts. And then autistic people reported the most common reason for not telling anyone they felt suicidal is because they were not sure how to express their thoughts. There are tools developed with and for young autistic people and adults that could help an autistic person monitor and report their mental health. We put that in the resource. So, it's always best to ask somebody if you're concerned about them, if they're thinking of, if they have thoughts of suicide, if they have plans of suicide. There's research that shows it's not going to put the idea in their head, which most parents and, other support people are kind of leery of and afraid to do. Research has shown it does not do that. And it's okay to ask those questions if you're concerned about somebody. And in fact, for autistic people, it could open that door that they don't know how to open and start that conversation that they don't know how to start. So this next warning sign of suicide, no words to communicate acute distress. Taylor, an autistic woman diagnosed later in life, has developed PTSD due to experiencing numerous traumatic experiences in her life. When triggered, she finds she has lost the ability to communicate. The words she wants to say are swirling around so fast in her thoughts, she can't access them. And when Taylor needs help the most, she can't reach out for help. She wants to connect, but it's not possible in that moment. She's not withdrawing, although it can look that way to other people. She appears calm. Words are important to Taylor in navigating through life, and when she loses them, it frightens her. Losing the ability to communicate is defeating, scary, confusing, and gives her a feeling of helplessness, which triggers her and causes her to feel even more isolated and alone. So in this scenario, which these are just excerpts, there's more to it in the actual resource. Autistic people can lose the ability, verbal autistic people can lose the ability to communicate when in acute distress. So whatever is happening in their brain that allows words to come out of their mouths is broken, it's gone, and they have no way to communicate what's going on inside of them, and they look perfectly fine and calm on the outside. That's my experience, and that's been the experience of many, many other people that I have talked to, autistic people that I've talked to. And what happens there is it's very, very tricky to support them because they look calm and fine. So the way it goes is if you were, a person supporting some people in a room and you walked in and there was one person who was just very visibly upset, pacing, crying, very visibly upset, and another person sitting in a chair quietly crying to themselves, upset, obviously, and then another person sitting in a chair, just calmly sitting in a chair, no emotion on their face, no outward, expression of distress or anxiety or anything, just calm. For an autistic person, that calm one could be in the most crisis, and they may not be able to tell anyone that they are. When that has happened to me before, I've been able to get out something to the effect of, I have no words, and been told, okay, well, when you're ready to talk, let me know. And the end of, the support happened and it was gone. And I was in a worse crisis than when I was, crying. So it's kind of like it goes from you know, something happens, you have some outward display of emotion, you get in more of a crisis, and all of a sudden you're calm, you can't tell anyone, and that's it. So what can happen if you're supporting a person, an autistic person like that, and they all of a sudden, you know, lose the ability to communicate? There are ways that you can communicate with them. They can possibly write or draw something. If they have an assistive device, they could possibly use that. Emojis are good for communicating things. And sometimes emojis can work when you're trying to tell somebody, and especially if you're working with somebody who you are working with them, you know, more than just one time, you know, you can establish what emojis mean what. And so all they have to do is send this emoji to you and you know exactly what it means. And then allowing them to regulate can bring that ability to communicate back. So there's very little research in this area. There is some information about insufficient speech and inconsistent speech and the associated challenges for autistic adults. Some autistic adults who have attempted suicide are significantly more likely to report not telling anyone because of not knowing how to communicate this to others. Also, I've heard from the autistic adults I support who are suicidal is they start not telling anybody because they're not believed. And the reason why they're not believed is because they look calm when they say it, which is one of the scenarios in the resource. I'm not sure I have it here tonight, but research has identified a non-speaking way for a person to describe what happened in the lead up to self-harm using some cards that are sorted into like a timeline of thoughts, feelings, behaviors, and situations. And they're pre-made, and they can just put down then what happened, and they don't have to, you know, verbalize it. This one, which is a new focus on death-related topics that are not a special interest, this one also can be tricky. Jin calmly stated he wanted to kill himself one day after school. There was no emotion. He was not agitated, but rather matter of fact. He could not articulate why. Jin continued to focus on suicide. He mentioned people in the news who had died, talked about people in movies dying, and discussed the best ways to die. There was no known traumatic event that precipitated this subject. The words were not from a movie, a self-stimulatory behavior, or a special interest. So if I'm out with, you know, in person, I ask people, you know, how they might support Jin, because he just comes home from school one day, nothing's happened. So it's a normal day. He doesn't have any emotions to show that he's distressed or anything like that, and says he wants to kill himself. And you know, it has to be that his words weigh more than any kind of outward emotion he might display with those words. The words have to have as much meaning as if he was crying or tearing his clothes or knocking things over, which, you know, that kind of outward display of emotion tends to get people's attention, and they tend to take that pretty seriously. But him stating he wants to kill himself has to be taken just as serious, even though he's calm. Remember that honesty, and that, you know, blunt honesty, and the fact that, you know, alexithymia may not, you know, be able to show emotion. He may not even be able to feel emotions. Everything for a lot of autistic people happens internally. And so that he could look perfectly calm, and there could be a hurricane and a tornado going on inside of him. So his words have to have like 100% weight and to, you know, catch people's attention as much as outward displays of emotion. even if he can't articulate why. And so I would definitely support Jin in the fact that, you know, he is ready to go. I would try to find out what his plan was. I would try to find out if he had a day and time, and I would try to find out what he needs in any other area of, you know, the reasons why he wants to die by suicide. He definitely needs support. And this is one of the warning signs that has two scenarios. Ayana's best friend, her dog Buddy, died after a short illness. He'd always been a part of her life. He was someone she could talk to about anything. He was a good listener. Ayana talked nonstop about going to be with Buddy. After a while, Ayana went back to being herself. She happily participated in activities at school and at home. It was as if a heavy burden had been lifted. Her friends and family were relieved until her brother overheard her talking out loud to Buddy as if she would be seeing him soon. And after some investigation, her family found out her plans to kill herself to join Buddy, which was why she was so happy. And that is something that people don't understand as well, is they can be concerned about somebody, concerned that, you know, they're showing signs of suicide. There's some concern there for somebody, and then they go back to being normal. And a lot of people are so relieved that this person's acting, you know, more like themselves again, that they think that the crisis is over, but it's not. What's happened is a decision has been made. And so they're more of a crisis than they were when they were acting in a way that was concerning. And that actually happened to me back in 2014. I was suicidal. I did make an attempt. And right before I made an attempt, I went to work a couple of days, and people, you know, noticed that I was, you know, kind of lighter, or, you know, they were glad to see that smile back on my face, things like that. But that was because I had made the decision. And so really, people really need to understand that. And the fact that she was saying about going to be with Buddy, the literalness of knowing that she's autistic and saying she's going to be with Buddy, that should perk up anybody's ears, because autistic people, again, are very literal. And how can she go be with Buddy who's dead unless she is? So, you know, that's another big warning sign there in this scenario. So the research of both Jin and Ayana says that many autistic people can report suicidal thoughts or behaviors without necessarily showing the same degree of distress as seen in non-autistic people. And because of this, many autistic people report not being believed when they report suicidal intent. Some people who have died by suicide, including autistic people, have been found to have extensively researched suicide methods or to have shown a sudden increase in mood before a suicide attempt. So the main points in this resource is to watch for changes from baseline as far as withdrawing, regulating, anxiety, self-harm, or depression. A lot of the warning signs are based in changes from baseline. So withdrawing's okay, but if someone's withdrawing after school for, say, an hour, and they come out and they can do the rest of the night just fine, and then all of a sudden they're withdrawing for an hour and a half and they come out and they can't do the rest of the night just fine, you know, that's a cause of concern to have a conversation with the autistic person that's experiencing that. Having trouble regulating and staying regulated, you know, more anxiety, more self-harm, more depression. Also know that autistic people in crisis may not behave like non-autistic people in crisis. This is really, really important. It's really hard to become concerned about somebody who does not look like they're in crisis. And the only way, you might know is by their words, but when words don't go along with actions, it's really hard. But knowing they're autistic, that really has to be part of it. They don't have to look like they're in distress. If they say they're in distress, they're in distress. If they are in a crisis, they may not be able to verbalize their emotions. They may not be able to explain what they're feeling. Having that very literal conversation with them, few words as possible, getting straight to the point, using, maybe past experiences to try to understand what they're feeling. They might be feeling like they did when they got bullied in school. They might be feeling like they did when no one came to their birthday party, or, they tried to make plans with somebody and they kept canceling them. Something from the past some experience can be brought up and say, I feel this way, even though they may not be able to tell how they're feeling using emotional words. A new focus on death-related topics. They have to discern between special passion and suicidal thoughts and behaviors. Some autistic people have a special passion and intense interest in suicide of, actors or actresses, important, politicians, people in important positions. That might be their special interest. If I was supporting somebody or knew somebody who had a special passion about suicide, I would really kind of keep in check with them that it's not turning into suicidal ideation, that it's not turning into something inward that they're starting to experience instead of the special passion. But also remember that special passions are, really make an autistic person feel great. That's why, they want to do it all the time. So there's that too, but I would just be a little concerned, just be a little, watch them a little bit. Many may research ways to die by suicide, and there's a lot of stuff out there on the internet. And what may be traumatic to an autistic person could be different from what causes trauma in non-autistic people. So if you're supporting somebody who's autistic and they're not showing emotions and they're saying they're going to harm themselves or they're going to die by suicide, and you kind of in that conversation ask them why, and it doesn't seem like anything that might want to make somebody, hurt themselves or die by suicide, it's different for autistic people. So, making assumptions based on what's traumatic for them as far as what might be traumatic for a non-autistic person would be unsupportive. And I would just be glad that they're able to talk about it and verbalize it, and definitely, be as concerned about it as they are. So the third resource I'm going to talk about today is Reasons for Living. This is a brand new resource that was just recently put out there for people to use. It's like all the rest of them, it's a free downloadable resource on my website. The Autism and Suicide Prevention Work Group developed this suicide prevention resource specifically for autistic people. So all of our other resources were developed for people who support autistic people. And this one is for autistic people themselves, but can also be used by people who support them as well. And we're just going to go through some of the pieces of it. So first of all, why are reasons for living important? Well, first of all, it's a way to remind you why not to die. And it can also give hope for the future, hope for the present. It can help regulate feelings and emotions. It can remind you of your purpose, which is very important for autistic people. I didn't really talk about it a lot in this presentation, but masking is a huge part of why autistic people are socially successful. So they mask their autism, they mask traits, autistic traits, so they look and act like everybody else. So they're suppressing their autistic traits, they're suppressing their stimming, which helps them to regulate. They're suppressing all the sensory stimulation in the environment. They're doing it all so they can fit in and have that job and have that friendship and maybe have that marriage. And it's exhausting. It's also a unique risk factor of suicide. But it also can cause an autistic person to not really develop a sense of self, because they're always masking as somebody else. And they're always, at work or, social events, being somebody else. And so they may have done that from childhood. So if they're diagnosed later in life, so they may never have developed a sense of who they are. So reminding them of their purpose is really, really important. So reminding them who they are and what they can do is very important. So in creating the list, there's questions on the resource. What's one reason I want to stay alive is one question. What's one thing that I love? And the reason why it's one is so that the autistic person, doesn't get overwhelmed when they're trying to make the list. What do I want to keep doing? So what are they doing now that they want to keep doing? And it could be something to do with their special interest and intense passion. It could be watching a Netflix movie that's, one of those sitcoms that may have, some more seasons to come. What object, pet, or person is very important to me? And so again, it's not just people here, it's objects, pets, or people that are very important to me. A lot of safety plans and, things like somebody might just say for support to, put down somebody's phone number. But a lot of autistic adults, especially those diagnosed later in life, do not have that network of support. So they may have an object, they may have a color, wrap yourself up in your purple blanket, that could calm them in the moment that they need to be, regulated. And then what goals do I have for the future? So again, forward moving, forward looking. So some things to remember. First of all, living with thoughts of suicide can be very difficult. For autistic people, it also comes with rumination and perseveration. Sometimes it's always on their mind. So whether they're doing this themselves or whether they're doing this with somebody who is supporting them, it has to be that the autistic person decides their reasons for living. And the reason why we put this in the resource is because, a reason for living might be, somebody is collecting coins and they want to find that next real cool coin. Or, they like, speaking of coins, they like flipping quarters. If that's enough, some people may come and say, well, that's not enough to keep you, it might keep you alive, but it might be for them. Reasons can change over time. So reasons for living lists may change over time. That same 988 call that I shared at the beginning of the presentation about the person who hung up on me, thankfully, I was also texting a friend, and she immediately asked me, well, where's your list of reasons for living? And I need a new one. So I told her that, I've done all the things, I need to write a new one. So she started talking about, well, we started talking about bubble tea, which perked my interest. What is bubble tea? And that was enough to keep me going while I was, dysregulated from this 988 call. So reasons can change over time, and for many, many reasons. So the list can be updated and really needs to sometimes just have a look over and update it. And it's not easy to make a list of reasons for living, because when you're making it, you're usually regulated and usually in a good place. And there's a lot, you might be thinking of a lot, or you might not be able to think of any, which is hard. So it does not need to be finished all at once. For an autistic adult, it's okay to ask for help. And these goes for young adults too. And, suicide affects autistic kids as young as 10 years old. And they can have a list of reasons for living too. And it can be pictures, and they could draw their reasons for living. People do not need to be anyone's reasons for living, but they can be. So people don't need to be on a list of reasons for living. A lot of autistic people, especially those diagnosed later in life, just don't have a lot of people in their lives. I lead a couple of support groups, co-facilitate actually a couple of support groups of over 50 people over 50 years old. And, I hear time and time again them say, and these are monthly support groups, that this is their only time they socialize. It's really hard for non-autistic people when you start getting up there in years, to have a pretty big support group and support network. So it's really pretty difficult for autistic people as well. Reasons for living can be big, noble, or they could be small and meaningful. It really doesn't matter. It has to be something that the person who's listed is, it's important to them. And a list doesn't have to just be words. It can be pictures, symbols, it can be drawings, it can be anything that, the person, wants on it. But it really should be on paper, just in case a phone dies or they can't find their phone at a certain period of time. So they can remember it when dysregulated or in a crisis. It should be kept in the same place all the time. This is where routine based, and, sticking to a schedule comes in handy. So when do they use the list? Whenever they have thoughts of harming or killing themselves, when they're unsure about continuing to live. It could be when they're triggered, if they have PTSD. It can be if something happened. It could be if they're having really high anxiety and some impending doom, they might need to read the list. They could just read the list to know it's there even. I can say that, somebody helped me make a list, in the year that I was, having my suicidal crisis, and I didn't even buy into it. I didn't think it was going to work. I half-heartedly, participated in making the list, and I used that list over the years, and it's dog-eared, and I do need to make another one, but it was very, very helpful. But I did have to take it out and use it, which I did. So how do you use it? Holding it in your hand seemed to be really helpful. It's something tangible. It kind of helps to, have the things on the list not be so vague and unreachable. You can read it silently, you can read it out loud, you can read it over and over and over again. You can read one reason at a time and then think about that reason pretty carefully, and possibly doing it might help. Draw pictures or look at the pictures that are on your reason for living list. Write the list again and again if needed, because some people, just writing it over again helps. And then it's okay to update your list when you need to. It's important to actually to change if your reasons for living change. It's really important to make sure if something big happens in somebody's life. So I know of a teenager who had their dog listed as their reason for living. First of all, that was their dog. And then their dog passed away. And so if that list wasn't updated and they were in a crisis and they went to get their list and they saw that their dog was still on the list, that would be devastating for them. It would not work the way it's supposed to work. So it's important to keep it updated. And then, do that when you're regulated so that you can make any necessary changes. And it's important that the list of reasons for living is always relevant. So in conclusion, we all have a role to play in suicide prevention efforts. And then learning directly from autistic people with lived experience of suicidality is really, really important. I learned things new from autistic people who experience suicide, suicidality, suicidal ideation all the time. That lived experience is really, really important. Don't be afraid to ask about suicidal thoughts. You're not going to put the idea in their mind. We have the research that shows that, and then really listen to the answer. And you might have to listen with that literal ear. They're not going to hint. They're not going to get hints, most likely. There's not going to be anything between the lines. They're most likely going to be very literal, very honest. Remember, this is so important, that autistic distress may not look like neurotypical distress. So you can't really help a person based on how distressed they look. It really has to be, if they can verbalize it, what they feel inside, is because it could all be happening internally. Make use of the growing number of autism-specific crisis resources. We have 4, and now we are working on the 5th, which is going to be helping autistic adults make use of crisis lines, because so many autistic adults have that same experience that I had, and they are refusing to, I'm not going to call that again. That was not helpful, but there's nothing else out there. So the crisis lines are out there, and we want to, make a resource to help them to be able to successfully use it without being unintentionally harmed. That's the one we're working on now. And then advocate for more autism-specific training for crisis center workers, emergency department clinicians, and other mental health professionals. I think everybody, once they find out about autistic people, it's pretty easy to support them. It's just not knowing is the difficulty. And I think we have time for questions now.